Regi Mathew 1, Drive. S. Balasundari 2. The Parable of the Lost Daughter, written in Telugu and translated by Uma Brugubanda, revolves around Suvarthavani, an intelligent, academically bright and a beautiful Dalit Christian girl. Suvarthavani is the daughter of Paladasu, who works as a carpenter during the daytime and is a rickshaw puller at night, and Krupamma. Despite their poverty and bitter existence, the couple struggle hard to educate her as they wanted their daughter to have a life that was unlike theirs. They wanted her to be happy and respected, and they believed that education alone helped a person achieve these. Vinodini 167. As Suvarthavani completes post-graduation from a college in Rajamundry and befriends a Brahmin girl, Gayatri, she gets impressed by the latter's upper caste life. She consequently develops a fondness for her friend's upper caste ways characterized by a simultaneous dislike and rejection of her own community and practices. Being pretty, educated and intelligent, she sees her caste as the only detrimental aspect in her life. Hence Suvarthavani's growing fondness for Gayatri's Brahmin family is accompanied by a rising contempt for her own family and community. She tries to distance herself from her Christian Dalit self, and attempts to adorn the Brahmanical mask, considering it to be a signifier of elegance, respect and status. Her Dalit existence shames her as much as she admires the ways of her friend's Brahmin household. Similar to the colored woman who endeavors to whiten the black race, Vani longs for sanctification of all Dalits, Jyotirmayan Ramesh 146. Like the colonized self who accepts and internalizes his own inferiority and the superiority of the colonizer and attempts to be like the latter, Suvarthavani becomes the Fanonian black woman. With a Brahmanical mask, Jyotirmayan Ramesh 146, and an archetype of the oppressed woman who looks up to and yearns to be like her elite sisters of the higher castes. She dresses up and talks like the upper caste. As she comes, or at least as she thinks, closer to her friend's upper caste family, she sheds off parts of her Dalit existence and identity. Just like she drops the Suvartha from her name and abbreviates it to Vani or S. Vani, she attempts to estrange herself from her very roots of existence. She forces herself to develop a taste for Sanskrit, classical literature and poetry, all of which she considers are markers of elegance and sophistication. She fusses about aspects of touch, purity and cleanliness at home and gives up eating meat. She also develops other habits like bunking church, wearing a red thread around her wrist like many Hindus do, and wearing a batu whenever she visited Gayatri's house. 168. Not only does she pay extra attention to her appearance, manners and language, she also insists and expects the same from the members of her family. The comparison she draws between her lackluster family and life, and the supposedly elegant life led by Gayatri's family makes her come closer to the latter and estrange herself from her own dearest ones. When Suvarthavani has to attend a spot valuation at a university in Hyderabad, she decides to stay with Gayatri's parents who recently shifted there. Although Gayatri settled abroad following her marriage, Suvarthavani feels that she still enjoys the same freedom in the house. She fails to notice the discomfort and contempt in Gayatri's parents' attitude towards her and thinks of them as her own family. It is during her week-long stay with her friend's family that she finally sees their real colors. From this point, the story binds together feminist and Dalit concerns, taking on the question of a woman's status and position in a male-dominated society, particularly emphasizing the status of a Dalit woman in a caste-ridden male-dominated society. Although the story primarily revolves around the central character, Suvarthavani, and caste issues, it also highlights the secondary position faced by women in the society, regardless of caste or class. This is reflected through the attitude and behavior of the men in the story towards women and also through certain customs such as the menstrual taboo. Menstruating women are often considered impure, and are required to follow certain practices during their menstruating days. During Suvarthavani's stay at Gayatri's house in Hyderabad, she is worried about whether she might menstruate. To put it in simpler terms, she is worried about the beliefs and practices followed by Gayatri's Brahmin family in relation to menstruation. She wonders about whether or not to tell Gayatri's mother or sister about her menstruation and how to dispose the used pads if she hides her menstruating status from them. Most importantly, she is anxious about the kind of practices followed by the menstruating women in their family. Would she also have to sit separately in that small space near the bathroom without touching the rest of like Gayatri's sister did recently? Would she have to wash her one plate and glass and leave it here too? 172-73. The story also hints that menstrual taboo is higher among the upper castes, as such concerns do not really matter in Suvarthavani's own house. The position accorded to women in a patriarchal space, particularly the position of the Dalit woman, is best exemplified through two significant characters in the tale, Mr. Piratla Subramaniam and Gayatri's brother-in-law. During her stay at Gayatri's place, Suvarthavani is disturbed by the attitude of Gayatri's brother-in-law. One day as she is on her way back home, he offers her a lift, deliberately aiming at the potholes and applying brakes unnecessarily. He takes her to a cafe and expresses his opinion on the sexual and moral codes of Dalit Christian girls and talks about his friendly 174 relations with several of them. His thoughts about using Dalit women for sexual pleasure and his cheap remarks on the women of her community shocks her. Brother-in-law's remarks remind the readers of a line from Vinodini's story, Maria, no one practices untouchability when it comes to sex, QTD, in quote. One can also trace parallels to the hegemonic power that the white man assumes to sleep with his black female slaves with that of the Brahmin man's ideological hegemony that stereotypes Dalit women as being careless in morality and chastity, Jyotirmai and Ramesh 147. She realizes that despite his external gentlemanly appearance and claims of being a respectable Brahmin, he is every bit a male chauvinist who has no respect for women, particularly for those from the lower castes. Gayatri's father, Subramaniam, is a writer who has authored numerous books, the subjects of which are oppressed castes, exploited classes, the poor and the needy, lonely women, and prostitutes. 172. As a writer, he espouses rather progressive and modern views, and his narratives often feature handsome young men from upper castes marrying women from the lower castes or class. One naturally expects Subramaniam to be a progressive-minded writer with a remarkable sense of social equality and a creative artist with enough of broad-mindedness to accept those on the fringes of the social sphere. His willingness to take up even prostitutes as subjects of his literary creations creates an impressive mark in the minds of the readers. However, the reality of his attitude towards women is far from what he depicts in his writings. This is clearly seen in his attitude towards his wife, Kamswarama. During her week-long stay at Gayatri's house, Suvarthavani observes that Subramaniam is always nagging his wife or scolding someone or the other loudly over the phone. 172. But the depth of his patriarchal dominance and caste prejudices are blatantly exposed when Suvarthavani hears him shouting at his wife when he returns home at night and sees that Kamswarama has missed out one bolt when the carpenter came home to repair the bolts. "You filthy bitch, what have you been doing all day, displaying your body to those low-caste bastards? You rotten old whore, why was the bolt not fitted on the main gate? Did you sleep with those bastards that you let them off with only half the work done? You mala bitch, you madiga bitch, you act just like those low-caste bitches. You have picked up all their habits, you Christian bitch, why don't you hook up with those bastard of a carpenter, those mala madiga buggers?" He went on and on. There was no shutting him up. 176. His abusive language sums up his attitude towards women in the low castes. The hypocrisy and double standards of Subramaniam as a writer who voiced the concerns of the voiceless through his artistic creations is laid bare as Suvarthavani realizes that there was nothing in common between the lofty words spoken by the protagonists of those books authored by him and the abuses he used just now. 177. In fact, she realizes that his abuses are aimed not only at his wife, but also at the lower caste communities in the society. She understands that it was not just his wife that he abused. He had abused her too. He abused her caste, her religion, and the women of her community, and the men of her community. 177. In fact, Mr. Piratala Subramaniam has nothing but utter contempt for the women in his life and for the lower castes. He is merely one of those high caste writers and intellectuals who accept modernity and social equality in the open but hold on to such beliefs behind the closed doors. The attitude of these two men also reveal the dominant patriarchal strains in the gender relations in family and society. The man who abuses a woman for her follies, linking it to her supposedly sexually fallen nature, and woman being considered as a man's sexual property. Their words and attitude also cement and perpetuate gender hierarchy and caste prejudices. Hence Gayatri's father who abuses his wife as a woman with loose morals and her brother-in-law who thinks of lower caste women as objects of sexual pleasure are both representatives of a typical patriarchal mindset. This is no surprise since, for much of recorded history, women were the property of men, with their value as property measured largely by their sexual purity. Wisden 2017. Subramaniam's attitude also reveals the male tendency to link a woman's mistakes and character to her supposed imagined real sexual nature. When he discovers that his wife forgot to ask the carpenter to repair the bolt on the main gate, he immediately abuses her, claiming her to be a sexually fallen woman. Perhaps it is significant to note that while he writes of prostitutes in his stories probably espousing their cause, he considers his own wife as a rotten old whore. 176 for a slight mistake. Brother-in-law's remarks on the lower caste women and Subramaniam's contempt for them, as revealed through his abusive language, shocks Suvarthavani, and the truth finally dawns on her. While the former sees Dalit Christian girls as readily available sexual objects, the latter merely uses them to create literary pieces that talk of social equality and progress. She now thinks of all those experiences which she earlier overlooked as insignificant aspects in the way they dealt with her. She remembers how she does not object when Gayatri applies a batu on her face before taking her home, or when she refuses to apply turmeric on Suvarthavani's feet during a ceremony, pointing out that Brahmins shouldn't touch the feet of Harijans. 170. She recollects the remarks made by people surprised at her beauty and caste, and comments such as, "Are there such lovely girls among the Harijans?" 169. She ponders upon her foolish attempts to adorn a facade of upper caste mannerisms and her inability to recognize the hypocrisy of Gayatri's family. She began to think of the number of times he was humiliated and insulted because of her caste. She thought of the time Gayatri placed a batu on her forehead without even asking her. She thought of the time when Gayatri avoided drubbing turmeric on her feet alone in that large gathering of women. It didn't matter that she was her friend. She was a Harijan and therefore untouchable. Why did ever think that their customs and their language were respectable? Why could she not respect her own language and culture? 176. When Suvarthavani bids farewell to Gayatri's parents while leaving for the university on the final day of her stay, she purposefully avoids her batu, something that she always wore when she was at Gayatri's house. When Kamswarama reminds her that she has forgotten her batu, she replies, "No, mother. I haven't forgotten. I am a Christian girl. I am a Dalit girl." 177. Saying so, she walks out of the house. As she leaves the place without her batu and wearing her little Jesus pendant, which she had earlier hidden, she also sheds behind her mask of upper caste respect and accepts her own true self, her identity as a Dalit Christian woman. She accepts her religion, her caste and her self, as a girl with her own dignity and respect. She comes to terms with the roots of her existence. She no longer wishes to hide her real self behind a make-believe facade and is now confident and happy of who she is. She leaves behind pretensions and worries and steps into a world of freedom and liberation from social notions of caste and gender and her expectations of rising to meet them, a liberation that comes only when one accepts what or who one really is. She frees herself from the shackles she had put upon herself and embraces that part of her identity that she had been ashamed of for so long. Not allowing herself to be a victim of brother-in-law's sexual whims or Subramaniam's disdain for her caste, she thus finally emerges as a strong woman ready to lead her life on her own terms. Hence Suvarthavani returns to her roots, her family, community and identity, just as the prodigal son in the Gospel who repents and returns to his father. The Parable of the Lost Daughter, by M.M. Vinodini, highlights several issues related to caste and gender. It however takes a detour from the usually depicted representation of Dalit women as doubly marginalized victims and presents a well-educated and empowered girl being a prisoner in her self-constructed power maze. It outlines Suvarthavani's huge leaps to move as far as she could from them, her family and community, to reach the other side. Vinodini 169, her gradual realization of the hypocrisy of the upper castes and her own foolishness to be like them, and her final decision to come back to her identity as a Dalit Christian woman. It charts the journey of an educated, intelligent and beautiful girl who initially perceives her caste and religion as shameful, but eventually comes to terms with it. The self-introspective journey that she undertakes reminds the readers of the significance of mental, or inner, liberation, an aspect that is as important as the external aspects such as education and employment. True liberation in terms of caste or gender constraints can never be achieved if one believes in lopsided power binaries. At times, an internalized sense of supposed inferiority affects one's self-esteem and proves to be a great hurdle for those in the lower rungs of the social ladder. In framing the narrative of Suvarthavani, the writer points out the futility of creating a mimicked self, negating one's real identity. Such attempts only lead to internal conflicts and dilemmas. Suvarthavani's mistake does not lie in innocently aping Gayatri's upper caste family, it lies in the superiority she associates with them and the power equation she constructs in her mind, placing her own community in the secondary position. While she has almost all other desirable qualities such as intelligence, beauty, education, employment etc., it is her mental imprisonment to caste binaries that prevents her from accepting her real self and being happy. While Fanon's colonized puts on the white mask on his black skin, Suvarthavani puts on the upper caste garment on her Dalit self. But her liberation and independence lies in the fact that she is able to shed off this mask before it's too late. In her, the readers come across a girl who accepts her true identity and discovers her self. Thus, in a society where caste notions and patriarchy strut as norms, she emerges as a woman bold enough to break free of the mental shackles of caste and gender.